Good evening, and thank you for inviting me to share this time with you. It's a joy to be able to come in this way, despite all of the restrictions that we are facing, and to share with you from the Word of God. The pastor of one particular church got up one Sunday morning and told his congregation, I have bad news, and I have good news, and I have more bad news. And he said, okay, let me give you the bad news first. He said, the bad news is that our church roof is in urgent need of repair and is at risk of collapse. And as he said that, members of the congregation, quickly glanced up at the roof and kind of gave a gasp. And he said, the good news is that we have enough money to pay for the repair. And there was a visible sense of relief and almost an audible sigh of relief that went across the congregation as some nodded in relief. And he said, but the bad news is that the money that we need is still in your pockets. We all probably, most of us have heard these good news and bad news jokes. And today's sermon, in a sense, is a sermon or a theme of similar sentiment, which talks about good news and bad news. The good news is that the church is like a family. And the bad news is also the fact that the church is like a family. For most people, the most important thing in life is family. But family life is not easy. I've honestly come across very few families who have not gone through some struggle or the other. Some of you might have heard of Winston Churchill's famous speech when he said during World War II, we shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields, and we shall fight on the streets. We shall fight in the hills. Now, to some of us, maybe that quote sounds like our recent family times during lockdown, or it could even be like our recent vacation that we were just able to squeeze in. 1 Timothy chapter 5 is about the household of God. And he emphasizes that the household of God is like a family. And there are the responsibilities of a family. Paul in this chapter reminds us that how each of us regards each other reveals our own heart and our own attitudes. Your feelings about another person is a reflection of the state of your soul. In the last few weeks, you have been looking at various aspects of responsibility to the gospel. Earlier in this series, you looked at protecting the gospel, promoting the gospel, to pray for the protection and the promotion of the gospel. And here, Paul emphasizes another responsibility, a responsibility to care and provide for the needs of the family. Being a Christian is more than just getting truth right. Our attitudes matter. We must love others. We must respect others. And this is the message that Paul is giving the Ephesian church, Timothy as its pastor, and even for us today. Today, we live in a nation in which respect and love for others is probably a hollow echo. Our news often functions in a manner that totally demeans people. And 1 Timothy chapter 5 lays us in on our attitudes that we have towards each other, particularly towards how we treat each other in our church and in our families, the vulnerable and those who take care of us. And he says some hard things, some difficult things. When I look at this chapter, there are several categories of people that he has described in this. There are the men, which he subcategorizes into older men and younger men. There are women again, which he subcategorizes into older and younger. There are widows again that he subcategorizes by age of older and younger. Then there are elders and pastors. Then there are the leaders, the potential leaders, and then also those whom I might call the lapsed members. And in this chapter, there is such a lot of wealth of guidance about how we are to treat each other. And today, as we look at the care ministry of the church, I would like to focus on three aspects. Like a good Methodist preacher, I will stick to 3 points and apply that call to care in ministry in 3 ways. Our care ministry to each other in our interactions, our care ministry to the vulnerable, and our care ministry to our shepherds. I know that next week you're going to be looking a little more deeper at leadership, but here in this passage, as we focus on the care ministry, I see that Paul is not just talking about our care ministry in terms of the service that we do for the poor that are outside of our doors, but he's also talking about a care ministry that we do for each other within our doors. And we heard a little bit about that as Ian and Joella and Shaman and others talked about it this evening, which was extremely encouraging. In fact, while I was listening to that, I was thinking, maybe this sermon is really not relevant to Colpetty Methodist Church. There are 2 types of people that will walk in through our doors on a Sunday. The one type thinks, here am I, church, meet my needs. And these folk often leave our doors disappointed because we do not fulfill one of the callings that God has placed before us. And there's another type that walks in around and asks, where are the needs that I can meet? And these are the Lord's servants. They're not here to be served, but to serve. William Temple, it was, who said, the church is the one institution that exists primarily for the benefit of others who are not its members. So the care ministry to each other is found in verses 1 and 2. And Paul says, and he uses 2 words there when he describes about care. So it's not just about the care and the service that we give to those who are needy, but the care also which comes in our own interactions with each other, in which we demonstrate a certain quality of care. And Paul says, do not rebuke, but exhort. Do not rebuke, but exhort. Hidden in this verse is a profound insight. And that's something that I was talking about as we began as well. That the way we treat people depends on how we see them. And what is Paul saying? If we have a family perspective, if we see an older man in the congregation as a father, we will treat him with natural deference and respect. If we look at a younger man as a brother, we will treat him not as a rival, but as someone within our own family. Oftentimes in society and outside, we look at people as our rivals, those whom we are competing against, or those who are trying to get ahead of us. But here Paul is saying, no, consider those within our doors, within the walls of the church, within our membership as members of one family. The relationship speaks of openness, of honesty, of respect and concern for each other. And respect is the foundation for any healthy family or church. Believe it or not, all of the people that are in this church are in a very real way your relatives. No matter what kind of earthly family you come from, we all have the same Heavenly Father. And the way we talk to and about each other shows the respect that is proper within such a family. When Paul says, do not rebuke, this is the only place this word is used. And it means literally, do not strike at. Because later on in the passage, he actually tells Timothy, you must rebuke as well. So he's not talking a generalization and saying, you should not rebuke in general, but he's talking about the type of rebuke that we might give. And what is he telling? Timothy was told not to attack older men with words, but to treat them with respect. Not to rebuke or not to speak to them in a harsh, attacking manner. but it is to come alongside, to exhort. And that word to exhort conveys the idea of coming alongside to strengthen someone who is weak. Exhortation is encouragement to do what needs to be done. It has a picture of a coach helping the athlete to achieve their best. And that is what Paul is talking about. Of course, every family has some friction now and then. There are times when we need to get our troubles out on the table and sit around and talk about it. Paul isn't saying we should overlook problems or sweep things under the rug. What he's saying is that we owe each other the respect even when we disagree. And it is important how we disagree. And oftentimes, sometimes, when I'm in a meeting of our church, I wonder when I hear certain people speak at their tone, at their words, their choice of words, where the respect is, how they address each other or even the chair for that matter. And the question to ask ourselves is, how do we relate to each other? I had a look at the KMC website as I was preparing for this, and the first two words that come up as you open the screen, at least came up to me, was welcome home. And that is what I'm talking about. Do people feel that kind of welcome as they come in through our doors, as walking into their own home? And the website descriptor goes on to say KMC is a family called to be multicultural, multilingual, multi-generational community. It's very family terminology. And that's how your website describes KMC. Crossing cultural and generational barriers with respect. The question to ask as we call ourselves a family, this congregation, a diverse family, do we act like a family? A good family will show respect. We'll encourage each other, we'll coach each other to achieve the best potential that God has for them and His plans for their lives. Are we a group of people focused on serving Christ and serving people? KMC is a congregation of many faces and many talents combined as one body. How do we show that respect? And as we look at these two verses about respect and not rebuking and exhorting, I would like us to reflect on some questions ourselves as we apply these two verses to ourselves. How do we as KMC deal with conflict? How do we manage anger within our own selves? We can get angry about certain things that happen in the church. But even as scripture says, you can be angry, but do not sin. How do we relate to each other in our conversations? Paul in elsewhere states, let your conversation be seasoned as with salt. What about gossip? What about listening to each other, or do we shout each other down in our meetings and in our discussions? Somebody said that people will forget what you said. People may even forget what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel. Let's make people who come to KMC feel respected, young and old alike. And that is important. That generational divide is important. Do young people feel rejected, unlistened to, unheard within this congregation? Do older people feel disused and useless, disrespected within our services? As we move on in this chapter, from verses 3 on to 16, Paul talks about the second type of care, the care ministry to the vulnerable. And here he focuses on the widow. In the first century culture, widows were a real concern to the churches. In those days, when a wife lost her husband, there was hardly anything she could do to support herself. There are only a couple of business women actually mentioned in the New Testament. There is Lydia, the seller of purple, whom Paul met at Philippi. She evidently had found a trade where she could serve as a woman. And then there's Phoebe, who is called a deaconess from Cenchrea near Corinth, whom Paul talks about in Romans chapter 16. And she was a traveling woman and evidently a businesswoman herself. In those days, it was the norm that everyone got married. It is said that the family structure was one reason why the Roman Empire stood to be so strong and stable. Though it was pagan and though there were many forces that disintegrated it from within, the Roman Empire nevertheless survived for many centuries because of what they believed to be a strong family unit. Sadly, we do not see that today in modern day society, nor in our Sri Lankan society. I don't know what the figures are today, but a couple of years ago, we do know that there are around 500 marriages that take place in a day, over 18 million per year. Perhaps not so many now with our COVID scenarios, but anyhow. And the divorce rate in a normal year is 400 per day. And I'm also told by some of those who are lawyers whom I associate with that the highest number of cases in courts are divorce cases, more than any other type of cases. Last year, not last year, the year before last, in Mount Lavinia alone, there were 1,000 cases that were picked up. So that's a different scenario altogether about the family. But even so, in that case in which marriages are falling apart, there are people that are being left vulnerable. Not just the women, but the children and the men as well. While today it is different. Women and widows probably are capable of supporting themselves. But in Paul's day, a woman who found herself without a husband needed care. Sometimes she was provided for, but not always. And so Paul gives Timothy the admonition as to how to deal with this matter. The Bible has so much to say about the treatment of widows and honors them in a way which most cultures do not. Throughout the Bible, even as we look at the Old Testament, the Bible demands justice and love for them. God is called the father of the fatherless, a defender of the widows in Psalm 68 and verse 5. Widows are to be valued for who they are in themselves and deserve special honor, protection, and care. Throughout the Bible, justice and love are demanded for them, says John Stott in one of his books on the message of Timothy. And that is what scripture is talking about. Soon after the birth of the church, shortly after the day of Pentecost, the book of Acts talks about one of the first challenges the early church faced. And that was to do with the widows and the care of the widows. Because there was a group of widows who were feeling neglected in the daily distribution of food, in the care that they were receiving. They were feeling marginalized and overlooked. And that was the first internal problem that the early church faced. And it came out of that culture. And the solution to that, and that gives us almost the guideline for the selection of leadership when it talks about leaders who are supposed to be full of the Holy Spirit and able to serve, but those leaders who are selected to serve those widows in Acts chapter 6. And consequently, James, in his letter to the churches, in chapter 1 and verse 27, he says, this is what is true and undefiled religion, to look after the widows and the orphans. So this section can be divided into two, verses 3 to 8 and 9 to 16. 3 to 8 talks about the younger widows, 9 to 16 talks about the older widows. One is meant to receive honor, And the word kalos, or good, timao, in that section that talks about honoring the widow, is about value and appreciating that individual. And then it also says that these individuals need to be able to serve, and talks about their good works in that next section. I'm not going to go into how Paul advises us to deal with the widows, but I want to take the principle from here, that the call that we have as a church when we talk about care ministry is to look out for those who are vulnerable. It is told of Charles Spurgeon and his wife that they would refuse to give away the eggs that their chickens laid. And even close relatives, it is told, were told to pay for the eggs. And many people label them greedy or stingy. And there was no response to those criticisms. It was only after Mrs. Spurgeon died that the truth was finally revealed. Because what they were doing was, with the sale of those eggs, Mr. and Mrs. Spurgeon were supporting 2 elderly widows. But all the while they endured that criticism in silence. Paul here is saying to serve those who are vulnerable in our church family. And I think it would be fair to say that this is our first priority, to meet the needs of those who are vulnerable within our church family as well as outside. These might include single parent families, children who are away from their families, people with disabilities, folks that are out of work in this current context, victims of disaster, and so on. Paul's instructions to Timothy here actually have several principles. And in this section, from verses 4 to 7, he outlines certain principles upon which these widows were to receive care. And I believe these principles can also be applied to us in our care ministry to the vulnerable. And I see 4 principles that he presents to the church, the Ephesian church, in how they need to set about caring for the vulnerable. He says in verses 5 and also in verses 16 to look out for those who are really widows, the real widows. So what is he talking about? He's talking about identifying the need, those who really need. And the word here also, let me say, the word widow is translated the one who has suffered loss. It also means a deficiency, some kind of loss. And so it's not just about the one who has lost a husband, but the one who has suffered loss in different other contexts as well. The second thing he talks about is to be able to find out who has a support system. He says if any widow has children or grandchildren, and he's talking about the family. And so the question that we need to ask as we engage ourselves in a care ministry is also to identify the social nets and the support systems that are in place, in addition to that which we might be able to support or outside of what we might be able to give, so that our support is designated and focused on those who really need that support. A widow was cared for by the dowry that was given to her, and 2 options were laid to her. If she had children, she might stay with the deceased husband's home, where she could be maintained by her son, or she could also return to her parents, taking the dowry with her. And so Paul was saying, look out for those who are able to support themselves. Don't prioritize them. If they have other systems to be able to support them, let those systems kick in. And that's why it's important for us, as verse 16 says, to look out for those collaborations and the collaborators. As someone involved in this kind of work, that's a very important aspect of our work, to ensure that we do not duplicate what we do, and to be able to see that we work together in tandem with the other agencies that might be supporting as well. And then in verses 9 to 15, he also says that they need to be able to serve. He's talking about a group of widows that have lodged strangers, that have washed the feet of the saints, that have followed every good work. And that is an important aspect as we talk about care ministry in the church. It's not just about the handout, it's not just about a hand up, but it's also that ability to be able to serve, the opportunities to contribute, to serve, to be able to have a level of dignity. And as we are talking about this from a church perspective, we cannot ignore the fact that the responsibility to care is very much a family responsibility. Brief as it is, 3 times in this passage, the apostles underscores the responsibility of the family to look after all the people within our families. God is interested always in the helpless, the weak, the lonely, and the discouraged. And one of the major obligations as a church is to minister to those needs. And that is why the church exists. That is why Christian love has entered into our lives. That is why we meet the needs of those who would otherwise be neglected, lonely, and despairing. And that was a story that Charmin was talking about, the level of acceptance that she felt. Verse 8 actually is a very strong verse in which Paul says, if a man does not provide, especially for his family, he has disowned the faith and is equal to an unbeliever. Very strong words. And what is Paul saying? That if anyone does not provide for his relatives and especially for his immediate family, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Caring for the family is not an option. It's a command. It's a responsibility. It's an obligation. Caring for our church family is a command that we draw from here, just as much as caring for our own nuclear and extended families is a command that is very directly talked about in this. Over the last several years in my work with Leeds, one of those aspects of work was with children. And as within the child protection services, neglect is considered to be a category of child abuse. That's because a child cannot survive without some sort of family that will provide for that child. And God takes the same attitude. And we are called, despite what people might say, to still support them. One particular director of a company who was dying from cancer was visited by his church. And the minister started talking about his salvation and life after death. And he got very angry. And he said, you Christians, all you ever think about is what is going to happen to me after I die. If your God is so great, why doesn't he do something about the real problems in my life? My wife will have no money when I die. I have a bank mortgage on the house, and my daughter will not have money for her education. And he was so upset that he asked them to leave. A couple of weeks later, the leader who went along with the pastor told the pastor, I would like to go back and meet Mr. So-and-so. And so they went back again and met this man, and this leader told him, brother, I want to say I'm sorry for what we did the last time we were here. But I want to also say that some of us have got together and we've been working. Some of us are willing to pay the mortgage of your house. There's an owner of an apartment complex who's offered your wife a job as an apartment manager and to look after the janitorial services of that apartment. And the income should be able to pay for your daughter's education. I just want to know that your family will be cared for. The man wept. And a couple of weeks later, he died. He never became a Christian. But his wife thereafter came into that congregation. How do we, as KMC, meet the needs of those who are vulnerable, those outside of our congregation? This church is known for its generosity and support. How do we measure up to the support of our own? How do we practice those principles that Paul has laid down about identifying the needy, about looking for those social nets, looking for the collaborators, about opportunities for service, giving people that dignity as we provide for them? And the last aspect of care that Paul talks about in this passage is care ministry for our shepherds. When you begin to think of a pastor, what kind of image do you conjure up in your mind? What is the picture that you get as you see a pastor? The image I receive or I get in my own mind is a very simple man in a white suit, maybe in a pair of sandals, maybe on a motorcycle, most often, and not very well to do. You may think that pastors are a strange breed that kind of passes all understanding. Maybe they are. As one who began in the ministry of the Methodist Church, I know that it's not an easy place to be in. And here Paul is talking about the fact that we as congregations, from verses 17 to 21, have an obligation to care for our shepherds. Pastors are not perfect and they fail. They get discouraged and often they quit. A statistic that was done of a research in the US says that 1,700 pastors leave the ministry every month because of burnout, moral failure, or for some other reason. 50% of ministers quit within 5 years. There's a huge number of fallouts in that sector. Paul here in verses 17 to 18 talks about providing for our leaders, for our shepherds. He says that they are worthy of double honor. The word timi there means value, price, their worth. And when he says that a worker deserves his pay, he's talking about the reward, the stipend, the wages, the salary that we give our ministers. And it's interesting that Paul quotes from Deuteronomy, and he also quotes from Luke when he talks about the worker deserves his pay, which were the words that Jesus said. And he says, and he equates that to scripture and says, scripture says, do not muzzle an ox, and the worker deserves his pay. Care must be taken that our ministers are maintained. Those who are laborious in this work are worthy of double honor and esteem. I know I'm crossing over to the passage that is due to be preached the next week, but I'm sure Reverend Leslie will be the last person to be speaking on such a topic, and so I will continue to talk about this today. On one extreme, we have the prosperity gospel groups that have no qualms about their pastors wearing designer clothes, traveling in the most modern vehicles. and their homes being what they do have. But sadly, most of our churches believe that the minister must survive off the bare minimum. To them, if a pastor owns a home or has new cars or their children attend a private school, that is sometimes an issue. I had someone tell me, if a pastor is driving a car and not a van, I don't want to go to that church. I'm not talking about ministers serving for money, but I'm talking about us as congregation caring for our ministers. Today, how much would you pay for someone who comes in as your mason? Abbas, you would give him at least 2,000 rupees at the bare minimum. A daily wage for someone who does some manual work today would be even at least about 1,000 rupees a day, most often. But do we know how much we pay for our ministers? It wouldn't amount to that amount per day. What Paul is saying here is in keeping with what Israel was told concerning the Levites and the priests. He ordered that a tithe should be given to them. In 2 Chronicles chapter 31 and verse 14. And I have people often ask me this question. Can I give my tithes to ministries outside of the church? To those who are poor and are struggling? And I tell them you must do both. Support others, but don't neglect your tithe. Don't neglect what you are expected to give, the bare minimum at least, to your own church. Our tithes and offerings are what provide for the ministries of our church and pay for our pastors. If we do not give, how do we expect our ministers to do their work? The first responsibility to our shepherds in our care ministries to provide for them. The second is to protect them. Paul talks here in verse 19. He says, do not accept an accusation against an elder unless it can be confirmed by 2 or 3 witnesses. Protect our pastors and our leaders from false accusations. Make sure that you do not tolerate gossip and slander, but cover for them. And verses 20 to 21, Paul goes on to say, to preserve them, to pastor them. In fact, many people like to quote Paul in this context, particularly when you're having a shot, to say, take a little wine for the stomach. But actually, that is a reflection of Paul's pastoral concern for the health of his disciple, Timothy. And it comes in this context of preserving them, preserving their life, holding them accountable in what they do so that they do not fall or stumble. And Paul closes this section with a very solemn charge when he says, I solemnly charge you to carry these out without prejudice or partiality of any kind. Though Paul was primarily an apostle, he was most importantly a pastor. It is obvious that Reverend Dariju, pardon me for using your name, loves each of us and is concerned for us. He prays for us and thinks about us. This is what we see, but that is not all that there is. Reverend Leslie walks with us in ways that we cannot understand. His concern for us is so deep so that sometimes thoughts about ourselves might keep him up at night. He might read a newspaper or watch the news on TV and have thoughts about us in his mind. He worries that we might listen to some message from some other church online or receive some text from somebody and get led astray from the truth. When someone from this congregation passes away or goes into hospital for a PCR test or something, his emotions rise and he feels anxious. He will grieve with those who have lost and rejoice with those who have a new beginning. Reverend Leslie might move quite unknown to us from a funeral of a member to a wedding rehearsal or even a wedding of another. And he has to maintain that outward dignity, showing the right emotion in the right occasion. But inside he might be well haunted by the grief of the family that have lost somebody. And at the same time, the excitement of the young couple who are getting married. And he carries all of those emotions with him around every day. In our lives, we might typically endure one or two events at a time. We might change jobs, get married, attend a funeral, have some money problems, struggle to hold our marriage together, or deal with a rebellious child. But for our pastors, for our pastoral team, these are things that they experience every day. They're concerned for our marriages in trouble. They desperately want to relieve us of our financial struggles. They grieve with us over our troubled teenager. They rejoice when we find a new job. And they experience all of these emotions in a day because of us. How do we care for them? And so, as a congregation, as we reflect on these various aspects of care today, how do we measure up? How do we look after our shepherds? What safeguards do we have in place to deal with these issues? How do we ensure that our pastors are looked after, that they do not burn out? Are we an honoring church? Are you, as a member of this church, a fully functional member in serving and in giving? In closing, I would want to ask, what is the image you have of this church? Most people, when they think of a church, would like, if others outside, think of it like a lighthouse for the lost. And that's often how we would like others to see ourselves. There's a book that I read many years ago, and there's an opening story in that. The book is by Philip Yancey. And the book is called What's So Amazing About Grace. And it starts with the true story of a prostitute who tells of a horrific story in Chicago. And the story is told of how this prostitute describes to a social worker her homelessness, her inability to buy food for her 2-year-old daughter. And so out of her desperation, this woman has been renting out her 2-year-old daughter. You might be astounded by that. And you might think, okay, that's America, but let me tell you, that also happens here in Sri Lanka. I know that. I've seen stories of that in my own work experience at Leeds. And she would rent out her daughter. And as she went on with the story, he looked at her and he asked her a question. He said, have you ever thought of going to the church for help? And the book goes on to say that I will never forget the look of pure naive shock that crossed her face. Church, she cries. Why would I ever go there? I was already feeling terrible about myself. They just make me feel worse. I was so encouraged to hear Charmaine say that when she came in, no one looked down upon her in any way. And Yancey's point in telling this story is that in Jesus's day, the sinners and the vagabonds flocked to him, not away from him. These days, where do the hurting and the helpless turn to? Do they steer clear of his followers? Do they steer clear of this church? If someone was to suggest that they go to this church, to KMC, would they turn around and say, that church? Why would I ever go there? If prostitutes of Jesus' day flock to him, why is it that today our churches have become a place of ungrace rather than a source of healing, acceptance, protection, and nurture? The challenge before us as a church this evening, as a KMC family, is our ministry of care. Do we show each other respect? Do we welcome the vulnerable? And do we care for our ministerial staff on this church? May the Lord truly make us a community of care. Our intra-care for each other in respect, our inter-care in terms of helping the needy, and the upward care for our leadership. May God bless you.